The records from Harrowick State Hospital arrived here in Vault 13 as so many artifacts do, quietly and with the unmistakable weight of something that was never meant to surface again. They came in a battered gray box with no return address, delivered by a courier who left before our intake. Clerk could ask a single question. The label on the box listed only a year, 1986, and the word Ewing written in a hand that trembled more than age alone could explain. Inside were a dozen photographic negatives, several damaged contact sheets, and 3 small notebooks, the kind issued to low-level staff for jotting down chemical ratios or development timings. But these notebooks record something else entirely. They chart the unraveling perception of a young photographic technician named Mira Dalton, whose duties included documenting new admissions to Ward E in the final year. Before the wing was permanently sealed, Harrowick itself had a reputation long before Dalton ever stepped into its tiled corridors. It was a state-run psychiatric facility built during a period of chronic underfunding and political negligence. For decades, complaints of improper staffing, malfunctioning infrastructure, and inconsistent patient oversight circulated without consequence. By 1986, the hospital was operating with fewer than a third of the personnel originally allotted. Of all the building's wings, Ward E was considered the most problematic. Cold in winter, humid in summer, and persistently understaffed. The official explanation for its later closure cited structural issues, though if such an assessment was ever performed, no record of it is preserved in state archives. The materials we recovered suggest that the real reason may never have been written down. Dalton's notebooks begin simply enough. She describes the photography room attached to Ward E as cramped, dim, and perpetually out of alignment, hardly unusual for an aging institution. The room contained a fixed backdrop, a single overhead lamp, and a manually wound camera older than she was. She writes at first with clinical disinterest, noting light flicker, humidity, and chemical inconsistencies. These are the kinds of inconveniences any technician might record. But very gradually, her tone changes. She begins remarking on things that should not have changed at all. Subtle shifts in the shadows behind patients, lighting angles inconsistent with the room's fixtures, and eventually elements in the photographs that did not correspond to anything she witnessed with her own eyes. It is important to understand that Dalton was not prone to speculation. She was methodical, almost to a fault. When she observed a discrepancy, her first instinct was always mechanical. Faulty lamp, warped film, chemical contamination. Yet, the more she sought ordinary explanations, the more the anomalies resisted them, and the more carefully she documented her processes, the more the images diverged from what she remembered. Over time, a pattern emerges in her handwriting, small at first, then unmistakable. She circles specific corners of the photography room in her sketches. She revisits the same measurements day after day, convinced she must have recorded them incorrectly. And she notes repeatedly a sense that something in the room was shifting when no one was present. something subtle, something that seemed to deepen each morning. Crucially, Dalton's observations align with several fragments of staff testimony found among the loose papers in the box. A few nurses make brief references to patient complaints that someone was standing in the halls at night or that figures lingered at the edge of sight. These comments were never escalated, dismissed at the time as symptoms of stress or disorder. Yet, when placed alongside Dalton's notes, they form a picture of a wing quietly unraveling at the edges. The negatives themselves, fragile, curling, and partially fogged with age, contain distortions that no chemical process can fully explain. Shadows too long for the room, silhouettes suggesting depth where there should be none, and in several frames a shape that appears only faintly, as though the camera captured something the human eye refused to see. Dalton did not survive long enough to complete her final notebook. The last entry ends mid-sentence. The hospital's records from that period contain no mention of her departure. What follows is a reconstruction of what she witnessed, as best it can be pieced together from her notes, the surviving negatives, and the faint echoes of testimony left behind by others who worked the ward during its final uneasy months. This is the beginning of the portraits of Ward E. The materials from Harrowick State Hospital begin their account in late August of 1986, shortly after Mira Dalton was hired as a junior photographic technician. Her notebooks show a young worker trying to navigate a collapsing institution, malfunctioning lights, dwindling supplies, and a supervisor who had gone on indefinite medical leave. The hospital was struggling, and Dalton was one of the few new hires brought in to cover gaps, rather than to expand capacity. Her notes during these early days reveal no awareness of the events to come. She writes about the sticky film reels that snagged on their spools, the unpredictable humidity in the development room, and the way the overhead lamp in the Ward E photography room buzzed faintly every time the circuit flickered. These are not the words of someone expecting an anomaly. If anything, they show her trying to bring order to a neglected corner of an outdated system. The first indication of anything unusual occurs on September 6th, when she documents the intake photography for a new patient. Leonard Havel Dalton describes him plainly: thin, soft-spoken, with a slight tremor that he apologized for repeatedly, even though she barely noticed it. She positions him before the fixed backdrop, instructs him through the standard poses, and completes the session in less than 5 minutes. Nothing in her notes suggests any impression beyond mild sympathy for a man who seemed frightened to be there. But her entry from later that afternoon reveals the first small incongruity. While developing the negatives, she writes that the forward portrait appears brighter than the others, as if the lamp had steadied at just the right moment. This alone is unremarkable. The hospital's electrical system was notoriously unreliable, but when she enlarged the negative for inspection, she noticed that the illumination in the image did not match the overhead fixture she had used. The light source appeared lower than it should have been, striking Havel's face at an angle inconsistent with the lamp's fixed position. She does not escalate the issue. She does not even record it as a true anomaly. Instead, she writes a brief note to herself in the margin. Check lamp alignment. She would later confirm that the lamp had not moved. 2 days later, on September 8th, Dalton revisits Havel's profile shots. She compares them side by side on the light table and notices something else. The hair over his right eyebrow appears slightly longer in the forward portrait than in the profile taken only minutes earlier. She marks the discrepancy but hesitates to draw conclusions. Patients often fidget. Observers misremember. Lighting can deceive even a trained eye. Her uncertainty shows through her handwriting, careful, cautious, as though she is trying not to see more than what is there. What she does not know yet is that the wardy nursing logs for that same day record nothing unusual about Havel's appearance. No mention of grooming, no trimming of hair, no changes noted during rounds. Dalton has stumbled onto the first fracture, though she does not yet understand what is cracking. On September 9th, she photographs a second patient, Maeve Cordell, a young woman admitted for severe anxiety and dissociative symptoms. Her notes describe Cordell as tense but compliant, answering instructions with quiet nods. The session is straightforward. Dalton writes that she thanked the patient afterward for her patience, a small gesture that suggests Dalton was trying to treat her subjects with dignity despite the institutional indifference surrounding them. But when Dalton develops Cordell's portraits, she notices a second anomaly. Cordell, who had held steady eye contact with the camera during the session, appears in the print to be looking slightly to the left. Dalton reviews her memory carefully. She had centered the patient's gaze. She is certain of it. Again, she explains it away. Perhaps a momentary glance, perhaps her own recollection faltering, but she writes the discrepancy down. She is beginning to see a pattern she cannot yet articulate. It is around this time that a new voice enters the historical record. Dr. Malcolm Rourke, a psychiatrist who oversaw multiple patients in the East Wing. A recovered draft of an unsent memo, pulled from the faint impressions left on a discarded typewriter ribbon, shows him expressing concerns about the photography room used for Ward E intakes. He cites staff headaches, fluctuating temperatures, and electrical irregularities. He recommends relocating the photography process entirely. The memo was never delivered. Rourke's concerns vanish from the official record. Meanwhile, Dalton continues to isolate her observations. On the morning of September 11th, she inspects the photography room and discovers that its corners appear darker than she remembered. Not dramatically, but subtly, like a room that has shifted overnight. She measures the distance between the camera and backdrop, comparing it to past entries. The measurements are unchanged. Nothing in the physical space appears altered, yet something feels different. This is where the nature of her notes shifts. She begins asking nurses whether patients show changes in appearance between sessions. New bruises, altered posture, differences in grooming. The nurses report nothing. No injuries, no sudden shifts in behavior. No alterations that could explain what Dalton is seeing in the images. So Dalton returns to the photographs again, and this time she examines the shadows. She notices that the shadow behind Havel stretches farther than it should, given the lamp's fixed position directly overhead. She aligns the earlier negative beside the newer one. The shadow in the newer print is longer. She rechecks the lamp. It has not moved. She rechecks the backdrop. It is tightly secured as always. Her handwriting at the bottom of the page is restrained but unmistakably troubled. Light source does not match equipment. It is the first moment she acknowledges the possibility that nothing is wrong with her process. Something is wrong with the images themselves. What Dalton does not know is that during these same days, the Ward E night logs contain scattered patient complaints such as someone standing in the hallway at night or a figure seen in their peripheral vision. These reports appear only briefly, never followed up, dismissed each time as hallucination. But the timing aligns. Dalton's next notebook entry is the first to mention a sensation that she would later return to over and over. The room feels different in the mornings. That is where the earliest phase of her discovery truly begins. Dalton's note about the mornings might have been easy to overlook, a passing remark made after too many early shifts, too many chemical fumes, too many hours in a room designed without comfort in mind. But she returns to that line repeatedly over the next week, each time with slightly more weight. She begins describing the mornings in terms that suggest the room is not simply cold or dim, but altered. She writes that when she unlocks the door, something about the space feels reset, as though the air has settled differently from the previous night. Objects appear exactly as she left them, yet she perceives a faint sense of misalignment, like walking into a room where someone has quietly shifted a painting half an inch to the left. The change is imperceptible to logic, but undeniable to instinct. On September 12th, Dalton conducts her first deliberate test to determine whether the anomalies originate from her equipment or from the subjects themselves. At this point, she is still trying to rule out her own fallibility. She photographs an empty chair, positioned precisely where patients usually stand, and develops the negatives immediately. The exposures are perfect. No skewed lighting, no elongated shadows, no inconsistencies between frames. She repeats the test using a metal medication cart. Again, perfect results. Her conclusion is recorded in a single sentence that marks a turning point in her understanding. The distortions appear only when a patient is present. She does not yet attribute meaning to this. Her notes remain clinical, observational. If she is frightened, she does not admit it. The next notable event occurs on September 13th, when she photographs an older patient named Edwin Mars. The man was soft-featured, slumped slightly, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. Small details Dalton notes in passing. The session is unremarkable. Yet when she develops the negatives, something appears in the second exposure. A bruise. Specifically, a faint purplish mark under the patient's left eye, visible only in the second frame. Dalton immediately checks with the nurses on duty. None of them saw any bruise on Mars. He had no documented injuries. And when she sought him out the next morning to reassure herself, his skin was clear. The bruise existed only in the photograph. Dalton's writing tightens here. She abandons her usual methodical style and writes the next lines more quickly, as though she does not want to linger with the implications. The image is diverging from what I saw. No mechanical explanation. Must observe further. It is the first time she openly acknowledges that the discrepancy is not her error. Around this same time, patient reports in Ward E begin to reflect a quiet unease. The night staff mentions several instances in which patients claim to see someone standing near their beds or lingering in the hallway. None of these reports are followed up. In the culture of Harrowick, these were symptoms, not events. But the timing overlaps precisely with Dalton's developing concerns. On September 14th, Dalton records her first significant environmental observation. She writes that when she entered the photography room early that morning, the overhead lamp was already on. She is certain she had unplugged it the night before, a practice she had adopted because the lamp's wiring was unreliable. Yet here it was, humming faintly, radiating a thin trace of heat she could feel when she placed her hand near the housing. More concerning were the faint marks on the floor, smudges and shallow impressions near the backdrop. Dalton describes them as soft-soled footprints. She cannot confirm whether they belong to a staff member, but she writes that she had swept and mopped the floors herself the previous evening. These marks were not present when she closed the room. They were present when she opened it. Her entry ends with a line she would later echo in Part 2. I do not think I am the only one using this room. Her next entries attempt to make sense of the growing pattern. She begins carefully tracking the direction of the shadow distortions in her images. They appear consistently elongated toward the same fixed point in the room, the rear right corner behind the backdrop. Dalton sketches small diagrams showing the spatial layout, marking angles and distances precisely. Her measurements never change. The room does. What troubles her most is that the distortions increase with each new patient intake. The shadows grow deeper, more pronounced. The slight misalignment she noted in the earliest portraits becomes more noticeable, and the patients themselves, though unchanged in person, appear subtly altered in their prints. Hair slightly out of place, eyes not matching the direction of their gaze during the session, posture adjusted by a degree she cannot account for. Dalton writes, the images are creating a different version of the patient, one small change at a time. She still believes it is the room, not the people, that is responsible. But this changes on September 15th, when she photographs Cordell again for a follow-up. During the session, the young woman hesitates before stepping into the room, glancing toward the far wall as though seeing someone there. Dalton writes that Cordell was unusually quiet and kept shifting her gaze toward the plastic sheeting covering the old service access. Cordell does not say what she sees. Dalton does not ask. But the expression on the patient's face unsettles her. When she develops the images that afternoon, Dalton finds something new. The shadow behind Cordell has acquired depth. It is not merely longer. It appears darker at the center, as though something tall had stood behind her, blocking the overhead lamp in a way no physical object in the room could. Dalton tries to replicate the effect by holding objects behind the backdrop. She cannot. Her notes become more fragmented here. She writes in uncertain strokes. This shadow has weight. There is shape hidden inside it. The room is responding to their presence. This is the first moment she considers that whatever she is witnessing is not a fault of the camera, nor a misremembered detail, but an interaction between the patients and a space that predates her tenure. And it is here at the 15-day mark that the early phase of her discovery ends, not with clarity, but with the sense that something unseen has begun to wake. By mid-September, Dalton has moved beyond noticing inconsistencies and begins actively testing the limits of the anomaly. What stands out in her second notebook is not fear, but method. A deliberate attempt to map whatever is happening in that room. She measures distances, records temperature fluctuations, and sketches the room from memory between shifts. She is trying very carefully to keep the inexplicable within the boundaries of the observable. On September 17th, her observations become more structured. She enters the photography room before her shift officially begins and describes a distinct chill lingering in the air. A coolness inconsistent with the rest of the building. Harrowick was known for its inadequate heating and ventilation, but Dalton notes that the chill is localized specifically to the area in front of the backdrop. When she steps back toward the door, the air feels normal again. Temperature logs for that period show no recorded fluctuations. The building's climate system was too primitive to detect changes that subtle. Still, Dalton trusts her senses. She writes, feels colder where the patients stand. Not the whole room, just that space, like the air remembers something. She then compares 3 recent negatives, Havel, Mars, and Cordell, looking for shared elements beyond the elongated shadows she has already documented. What she finds is a progression. The earliest frames show only a slight distortion, but in the more recent images, the backdrop appears subtly warped, as though pulled toward that same right-hand corner. She circles that corner in her drawing once, pauses, then circles it again. And beneath the sketch, she writes, all of it points here. Dalton does not yet articulate what here means, but the right-hand corner behind the plastic sheeting, near the sealed-off service alcove, becomes the focal point of her observations. That afternoon, while preparing the chemicals for development, she leaves her notes on the enlarger table. When she returns 10 minutes later, she finds the pages slightly shifted. Not enough to suggest tampering, but enough that she registers the difference. She stands in the doorway for several moments, trying to convince herself she had placed them differently. Her entry that evening reads, I am misjudging things, or something in this room is subtle enough to go unnoticed until afterward. The next day, September 18th, brings one of the few external confirmations of Dalton's unease. A nurse's brief notation, hurried, almost an afterthought, states that multiple Ward E patients complained of restless nights and someone moving in the hallway. One patient insisted he saw a figure standing at the foot of his bed. These comments were dismissed as delusion. They always were. But the timing is significant. The descriptions appear only on nights following the most distorted photo sessions. Dalton had no access to these nursing logs. She worked in isolation, unaware that patients were reporting the very things her photographs implied. On the morning of September 19th, Dalton describes an event that marks a noticeable shift in her tone. When she entered the photography room, she felt what she calls a pressure in the air, as though the room were occupied not by a person. She is careful to emphasize that, but by presence, something that had weight without form. She stands still long enough to confirm she is alone. Her notebook for that day is terse, but the message is unambiguous. Cold at first, quiet, hard to breathe. It passed after a minute. Room felt empty again. When she begins her intake session later that morning, the patient, identified in staff rosters as a middle-aged man named Rourke, not the psychiatrist, pauses in the doorway and asks whether someone else is in the room. Dalton assures him they are alone. The patient does not look convinced. His photographs, once developed, are among the most striking of the early batch. The shadow behind him splits faintly, appearing to fork at the base like two overlapping silhouettes. Dalton examines the print for nearly an hour. She overlays it with earlier exposures. She tests for chemical bleed. She checks for double exposure artifacts. Nothing matches the effect. Her conclusion, written sparsely, shadow does not belong to the subject. On the 20th, Dalton attempts a different kind of test, one she does not record in detail, but which can be inferred from her notes. She lingers in the room between sessions, positioning herself exactly where patients stand, then where the distortions appear most pronounced. She remains still as if waiting for something. Her entry afterward: nothing changed, only reacts to them. This marks her first recognition that whatever is happening responds specifically to patients, not staff. She photographed a co-worker earlier in the week with no anomalies. She has taken empty room shots with no results. But every Ward E patient, without exception, produces distortions that grow more pronounced with each new session. Dalton is beginning to lose her frame of reference. Her notes become more introspective, as though she is unsure whether the anomaly is within the room or within her own perception. She writes, "What if the image is not reflecting the moment, but something parallel to it?" She crosses this line out, then writes beneath it, "Need more evidence." On September 21st, Dalton records an observation that is unsettling, not because of what changes, but because of what does not. She enters the room to find the overhead lamp on again, this time with the plug lying loosely against the baseboard. She tests the wiring twice, confirming that the power cannot run unless it is fully connected. She unplugs it again. She tests the switch. She tests the socket. Nothing is wrong. Nothing should allow the lamp to turn on by itself. Her entry ends with a line written more heavily than the surrounding text. "Something is waking up in this room." It is unclear whether she meant this literally or metaphorically, but it marks the point where observation begins to lean toward intuition, and where Dalton's fear, previously subdued, begins to show through her methodical veneer. The next entry, dated September 22nd, is the one that shifts the story from unusual to impossible, and it is the entry that sets the rest of the story in motion. The entry dated September 22nd represents the first moment Dalton commits, in writing, to the idea that what she is witnessing is no longer the product of misremembering or mechanical fault. There is no hesitation in her words now. The uncertainty that colored her earlier notes is gone. She describes her morning in clear, clinical strokes, as though she is bracing herself by reducing the experience to facts. She writes that when she arrived, the photography room's door felt cool to the touch, colder than the rest of the hallway. She unlocks it, steps inside, and immediately senses, not hears, not sees, but senses that someone else has been there. She notes the air feels displaced, disturbed. The space feels newly occupied, though she cannot articulate how she knows. The overhead lamp is on again, not a flicker, not a surge. It burns steadily, as if it had been running for hours. The air beneath it is warm. What catches her attention next are the scuff marks on the floor. Not smudges this time, not faint impressions, but clearer, more deliberate disturbances in the dust. Subtle arcs leading from the center of the room toward the right-hand corner behind the backdrop. Dalton kneels and studies them closely. They are not footprints. Not exactly. She writes, not the outline of a shoe, more like something pressed the floor from a higher angle, as if weight passed through, not across. This is the first time her language breaks from the mechanical world she understands. She is trying, unsuccessfully, to describe a shape that does not correspond to anything that leaves tracks. And then, for the first time, Dalton acknowledges fear. I did not want to get closer to the corner. It felt wrong from a distance. She circles this last sentence twice later that morning. A patient is brought in for intake. A man named William Hart, recently transferred from another facility. Dalton notes that as Hart approaches the photography room, he stops abruptly, looks past her shoulder, and asks whether someone else is inside. She tells him the room is empty. He hesitates longer than the others have. She writes that he steps inside only after she repeats her reassurance. This session is unusually brief. Hart keeps turning his head toward the right-hand corner, following something Dalton cannot perceive. She tries to complete the 3 standard poses, but Hart flinches during the forward portrait, snapping his eyes toward the spot behind her. When she asks if he is all right, he tells her, in a quiet voice, that someone just stepped behind the backdrop. Dalton inspects the space behind the backdrop immediately after the session. There is nothing there, only the sealed metal sheeting and the plastic covering it. But her hands are shaking when she records the observation. When she develops Hart's portraits later that day, she finds the most dramatic distortion she has seen so far. The shadow directly behind him is not only elongated, but divided, a central silhouette that appears split at the top, as though another shape is partially overlapping his. Dalton tries multiple enlargements. The effect remains. She writes, the shadow touches the floor at a different angle from Hart's body. It does not follow him. In the next lines, her handwriting becomes small, almost cramped. This one is darker, denser. I cannot see the edges clearly. She spends the next 3 hours in the development room conducting tests. She repeats enlargements. She inspects the film under different lights. She checks chemical mixtures. Nothing explains the anomaly. She even considers the possibility of sabotage, someone tampering with the film, but dismisses it on the grounds that no one else has access to the room. Her tone grows increasingly strained. She writes, "I know what I saw in the room. There was nothing behind him, but the print says otherwise." Dalton's notes record something else from that afternoon, something she does not dramatize, but which she cannot ignore. While reviewing the prints, she feels a faint shift of air behind her, just enough to stir the edges of one of the loose pages on her table. She turns. The door is closed. No vents are active. No one is there. Her only remark, "This room is reacting to something, or producing it." She continues cataloging images until well past her shift's end. At 10:42 p.m., she notes hearing movement in the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps, unaccompanied by voices. Harrowick often felt empty at night, but this sound is different, measured, singular. She waits for the footsteps to pass the door. They never do. Her final line for the night, "Hallway silent when I open the door." By the following morning, September 23rd, Dalton is no longer trying to hide her concern from herself. She writes that she is beginning to feel watched inside the room, especially near the point where patient shadows distort most strongly. But the most important entry of that day is not about her fear. It is about her realization. She writes, "The shadows do not stretch toward the light. They stretch toward the corner. The room is showing something that we cannot see." And then beneath these 2 lines, she adds a final thought, hesitant but revealing. "Whatever is in that corner is becoming clearer." This marks the close of the early discovery phase. Everything that follows stems from this realization, and from Dalton's choice to continue investigating a room that far more experienced staff refuse to enter at all. By September 24th, Dalton is no longer merely observing the anomalies. She is interacting with them, intentionally or not. Her notes shift from passive description to active experimentation. She is still cautious, still methodical, but the tone of her writing suggests a kind of inevitability. She knows, even if she does not admit it, that she has stepped into something she cannot step back out of. That morning, she writes that she arrived early and waited outside the photography room for several minutes, listening. She notes no sounds, no footsteps, no machinery, no voices. Yet she feels the distinct impression that something is on the other side of the door. Not movement. Presence. She unlocks the door anyway. Inside, she finds the room in perfect order except for one detail. The overhead lamp is off this time, but the bulb is warm, as though recently extinguished. Dalton touches the housing twice to confirm. Still warm. She writes only one line under this entry. "It was on before I opened the door." She then moves toward the right-hand corner, the focal point of her sketches, the place toward which all distorted shadows seem to reach. She stops 2 steps short. She writes that the air there feels thick, her own word, though she places it in quotation marks, as if unsure whether it is the correct description. Her next observation is one of the most telling in her entire notebook. The room is not cold today, only that corner feels wrong, as if the space is folded inward. This is the first time Dalton uses spatial language that implies distortion, not visual but physical. Later that morning, she photographs another patient, Andrea Hayes, a woman in her early 30s admitted for severe depressive episodes. Hayes has no known hallucination history, yet she reacts strongly when entering the photography room. Dalton writes that Hayes froze in the doorway, staring at the backdrop as though recognizing it. When Dalton asks if something is wrong, Hayes says she feels crowded, though the room is empty. During the session, Hayes continually shifts her weight. Glancing toward the right-hand corner, Dalton attempts to redirect her attention twice. Hayes complies, but moments later, her gaze drifts back. When Dalton develops the photographs that afternoon, she encounters the most pronounced shadow distortion yet. The silhouette behind Hayes bends slightly, as though drawn around a form that is not visible in the room. The shadow's curvature suggests the presence of something tall standing close behind her, something defined enough to influence the light, but not enough to appear directly. Dalton spends hours analyzing the print, overlaying it with previous images. The anomaly is consistent with the others, yet far more pronounced. She tries testing for flaws in the negative, but the effect is centered precisely at the convergence point she has been mapping for days. Her notes for that afternoon are brief. It is closer now, closer for them. That evening, Dalton performs an experiment she documents with surprising restraint. She positions herself where Hayes stood and imagines the unseen object at her back. She then steps toward the corner, 1 pace, 2 paces, until she is within arm's reach of the plastic sheeting. She writes, "The air felt wrong, as if something was occupying the same space, not visible, not tangible, but something was there." She does not remain long. Her next line is simply, "Left the room, could not stay." What Dalton does not know, what she could not have known at the time, is that this same night, a nurse in Ward E filed a report about a patient who refused to sleep, claiming someone had been standing in the corner of his room for several hours. The patient insisted that the figure did not move, did not speak, and did not leave until the lights were switched on. The nurse marked it as a hallucination. There is no follow-up, but the date is the same. On September 25th, Dalton attempts one final empirical test before escalating her concerns. She photographs nothing at all, an empty frame captured without the subject or the chair. She wants to prove the anomaly occurs only in relation to patients. She develops the film with meticulous care. The exposures are flawless, no distortion, no elongated shadows, no deepening darkness. She writes, "The room reacts to the patients react to the room." This line, understated yet precise, is the culmination of her entire discovery phase. It is her first recognition of reciprocity. Whatever is happening is not one-sided. It is not simply the camera capturing something unseen. It is not merely the shadows bending away from their subjects. It is not just patients reacting to an unsettling environment. It is an exchange. Dalton ends part 1 of her notes with a final quiet admission, a sentence written at the bottom of the page, separated from everything else by a long blank space. I think the photographs are not showing what happened. They are showing what is happening behind it. Behind it. Not behind the patient. Not behind the backdrop. Behind it. The moment, the perception, the visible boundary of the room. This is where part 1 ends. Not with a revelation, not with a catastrophe, but with Dalton's dawning realization that whatever lives in the corner of that sealed photography room is beginning to reveal itself. Not directly, but through the distortions it leaves behind on film. Everything that follows in part 2 grows from this realization and from Dalton's choice, disastrous though it was, to continue looking deeper. What distinguishes part 2 of the Ward E record from everything that came before is not the escalation of the anomalies themselves, though they do escalate, but the way Dalton's relationship to them changes. In part 1, she is a witness. In part 2, she becomes an investigator. The shift begins on September 26th, the day after her final empty room test. Dalton opens her notebook with a statement that marks a turning point in her understanding. The photographs have stopped showing errors. They are showing something consistent. This is the first time she acknowledges the phenomenon as an entity with rules. Not a malfunction, not random distortion. Something governed, something that responds to the presence of Ward E patients specifically. Her morning routine becomes more deliberate. She reports arriving early again, pausing before unlocking the photography room door. She listens, she waits, and finally she opens the door with a steadiness she does not feel. Inside, she finds a new detail. Several sheets of her notes, pages she had left clipped inside her notebook the previous night, are now lying on the enlarger table. She had not placed them there. No one else had keys. She writes, "Pages not where I left them. Nothing missing, nothing added, only moved." She tries to rationalize, perhaps a draft from the hall, perhaps she carried them without remembering. But the development room has no airflow, the ventilation fan long since broken. And she is exacting with her materials. She knows where she leaves things. Dalton then checks the right-hand corner behind the backdrop. The plastic sheeting appears slightly displaced, wrinkled along the upper edge. She touches it and notes that it feels colder than the rest of the room. Not dramatically colder, but enough that she withdraws her hand quickly. Her next intake session is with Cordell, the young woman with anxiety symptoms, who had already reacted strongly to the room. Cordell enters hesitantly, stopping just inside the doorway. Dalton notes that Cordell's hands shake, not from fear, but from a kind of anticipatory awareness. She keeps glancing toward the corner. During the forward portrait, Cordell whispers something too soft for Dalton to catch. The technician asks her to repeat it, but Cordell only shakes her head. The session continues, but Cordell looks increasingly distressed. When Dalton develops the negatives, she finds the second meaningful escalation in the record. The distortion behind Cordell is no longer confined to shadow elongation. It now contains contour. Dalton writes, "The shape behind her is no longer implied, it is forming, tall, slightly forward in posture, edges blurred but present." She studies it for nearly an hour. She compares it to earlier distortions. It is the same silhouette, but now undeniably humanoid. Her reaction is not panic, it is analysis. She sketches the outline to the best of her ability. Long, narrow, slightly forward-leaning, lacking clear boundaries. A figure that should not exist, yet introduces itself into every new exposure of certain patients. She checks other recent portraits. Havel, Mars, Hayes. The figure is faint in their earlier prints, but now, viewed in sequence, the progression becomes unmistakable. It has been there from the beginning. It is becoming clearer. Dalton notes something else, a pattern she had not fully recognized until now. The figure appears only behind patients assigned specifically to Ward E. When she photographed a staff member days earlier, nothing appeared. When she tested empty frames, the images remained pristine. Her conclusion: this thing is connected to Ward E, to its residents, to something that predates them. That afternoon, Dalton conducts a more deliberate experiment. She photographs Andrea Hayes again, not as a required intake, but as a follow-up. She does not record whether she obtained permission. She seems to have acted quietly, confident she would not be questioned. Hayes reacts more strongly this time. She stands stiffly during the session, eyes flicking upward, following a point in the air just past Dalton's shoulder. Dalton notes that Hayes whispers a question to herself. Is he still here? Dalton does not ask. Who, when she develops Hayes's new portraits, the figure behind her is clearer still, taller, leaning slightly forward as though hunching to remain unseen. The edges remain blurred, but the shape within the shadow is undeniable. Dalton's only comment: it is nearer than last time. Meanwhile, the Ward E nursing logs begin recording a different kind of patient complaint. Not merely sleeplessness or vague hallucinations, but statements that someone is watching, expressed by multiple patients over consecutive nights. The descriptions vary in wording but are consistent in tone. Something breathes near the walls, they say. Something lingers at the edges of light. Staff continue to dismiss these reports, but the timing matches the progression of Dalton's photographs exactly. On September 27th, Dalton documents the first direct interaction she experiences within the room, or at least the first she acknowledges. She writes that while reviewing negatives, she hears a sound behind her. Not a step, not breathing, more like fabric shifting. She turns, no one is there. The plastic sheeting in the corner ripples faintly, though there is no airflow. Her hands shake as she records this. The ink falters once, then steadies. Her final entry of the day. It is no longer only in the photographs. This is the moment Part 2 truly begins. Dalton returns to the photography room on September 28th with a new intention, not to test or document, but to observe the room itself. Her notes indicate she arrives before sunrise, well before any patients or staff would be present. There is no scheduled intake that morning. She has the room entirely to herself. She writes that the air is still cool, but not as sharply as before. The corners of the room, particularly the right-hand one, appear dense. Her word, as though the shadows hold more weight than they should. She stands in the doorway for several minutes, waiting for her eyes to adjust. When she finally steps inside, she performs an act she has avoided for nearly a week. She walks directly to the plastic sheeting. Her description is careful and unembellished, the way one might document a hazardous procedure in a laboratory. She presses her fingers lightly against the sheet and notes that the surface is warm, not cold. Warm in a way that suggests contact from the opposite side, though what lies behind the sheeting is solid metal plating welded shut decades earlier. She withdraws her hand almost immediately. Dalton then stands in the center of the room, at the exact point where the patients stand during intake, and closes her eyes. She is waiting for a sensation to clarify, one she has described only vaguely until now. The sense that the space around her holds tension, like a held breath. For nearly a full minute she notes nothing. Then she writes, "The space behind me shifted, not movement, compression." She does not elaborate on what that means. The rest of the line trails off. Later that morning, she resumes her intake photography as though nothing has changed. Her first subject is a man named Peter Sloan, admitted under emergency evaluation after a period of severe disorientation. Sloan is older than the typical Ward E patient, a man in his 60s with unsteady posture. Dalton remarks that he seems confused when escorted into the room, blinking several times as though adjusting to brightness that is not actually present. During the forward portrait, Sloan abruptly turns his head toward the corner. Not sharply, more like someone turning in response to a whisper spoken too close to the ear. Dalton writes, "I did not hear anything." Sloan then asks a question that unsettles her. "Do you need him to move?" Dalton asks who he means. Sloan stares at her blankly, as if he does not remember speaking. When she develops Sloan's images later that day, she finds the figure again, taller than before, hunched slightly forward, its posture mimicking someone leaning in to listen. Dalton begins overlaying Sloan's portrait with the others. She rotates each frame, aligns the shadows, measures relative lengths. The figure's position relative to the subject's is consistent across all prints. Always behind, always just out of alignment, always oriented toward the patient's right side. But the most disturbing pattern emerges when she examines the progression. Each new photograph shows the figure clearer, more defined. Each patient seems to draw it closer. She writes, "It is approaching, not in distance, but in clarity." Meanwhile, patient reports in Ward E grow more specific. One claims that something leans over the bed at night. Another says she feels someone whispering at her back during medication rounds. These reports are scattered, one on the 26th, two on the 27th, another on the morning of the 28th. but the language is consistent. Dalton does not see these logs, but her notes track the same pattern exactly. On September 29th, Dalton describes an event that her handwriting suggests she struggled to process. She arrives in the photography room and finds the backdrop shifted several centimeters to the right. The wall anchors remain secure, and the metal rod at the top has not moved, yet the fabric itself has repositioned as if pulled taut and then released. She inspects the fastenings twice. They are intact. She writes, "Fabric cannot move without being handled." She tries repositioning it, but it does not return cleanly to the original alignment. The tension is uneven, as though someone tugged the sheet in one direction. While reviewing her notes later that evening, she experiences what she initially assumes is eye strain. She writes that the shadows cast by the overhead lamp seem darker than usual, not blacker, but heavier, as though they extend downward rather than merely falling across the surface beneath them. She dims the lamp, increases it again, tests the bulb. The shadows remain unnaturally dense. Dalton's wording becomes sparse again. "Something has changed in the room's light. I cannot replicate it elsewhere." Later that night, she describes an incident in the hallway outside Ward E. While walking toward the stairwell after her shift, she hears footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, matching her pace. She stops. The footsteps stop. She walks again. The sound resumes. She turns. The hallway is empty. She writes only one more line. Sound did not match shoes on the tile. Whether she means the rhythm, the weight, or the velocity, she does not say. The next morning, September 30th, Dalton performs her most ambitious test yet. She asks a nurse to escort 2 patients, one after the other, into the photography room while she prepares to capture their images. Her goal is simple: to determine whether the figure's presence responds differently between individuals. The first patient is a young man named Julian, unremarkable in appearance, cooperative but distracted. Dalton notes nothing unusual in his behavior. His photographs show the figure faintly, farther back in the shadow's depth, present but distant. The second patient, however, Cordell again, provokes an immediate reaction. Upon entering the room, Cordell recoils, stepping backward as though struck by a wave of air. Dalton writes that she has never seen such an immediate response. Cordell begins crying softly, staring at the corner without blinking. Dalton tries to calm her, offering to postpone the session, but Cordell insists on staying, saying quietly, "It will keep happening. It wants to look." Dalton does not ask what she means. She senses that the patient is speaking honestly, but not lucidly. When Dalton develops the film, she finds the clearest image yet. A shadow not only extended, not only shaped, but subtly angled, as though leaning down toward Cordell's head. The figure has height, it has posture, it has intent. Dalton's closing entry for the day. It is no longer forming, it is observing. This marks the midpoint of Part 2, the moment when the phenomenon is no longer ambiguous, no longer implied. The figure behind the patients has begun to reveal itself, not in the room but in the medium Dalton alone controls. And Dalton, for reasons she never writes plainly, does not stop by October 1st. Dalton is no longer documenting isolated incidents. She is documenting a pattern that behaves almost like a cycle. Her entries begin earlier each morning, as though she is waking before dawn, driven by a sense that something meaningful will happen if she arrives in the room at the right moment. She notes 3 distinct phases that seem to recur through each day: a stillness in the early morning, an escalation during patient intake, a settling, never quite calmer, in the late evening. She begins writing phrases like, "It holds its shape longer now," or "The corner is not empty when the building is quiet." Phrases that suggest she has abandoned the idea of misinterpretation entirely. On the morning of the 1st, she describes unlocking the photography room to find the air unusually stale. Not musty, stale, like the room has been tightly sealed for far longer than a single night. Yet the vents, broken though they are, would not cause this. She steps inside and immediately notices that the overhead lamp casts a different quality of light. Not brighter, not dimmer, just changed. She writes that the shadows seem thicker, her word again in quotation marks, as though she does not fully trust her terminology. She tests the lamp. The bulb is the same. The wattage is correct. Her eyes, she insists, are not fatigued. She sketches the shadow cast by the chair in the center of the room and notes that it appears slightly wider at the base than it should, a small deviation, but consistent with the general pattern of unnatural distortion. The patients brought in that morning only deepen her concern. The first is Havel, returning for a follow-up evaluation. Havel seems unusually calm, more so than during his earlier sessions. Dalton writes that he enters the room without hesitation and stands exactly where instructed, but during the forward portrait he tilts his head slightly, as though someone is speaking softly beside him. Dalton notes, "He looked as if reacting to a voice not mine." When she develops Havel's images later, she nearly abandons her analysis. The figure behind him has gained a feature she had not seen before. Its positioning is no longer entirely behind the patient. It leans forward just enough that a faint suggestion of its upper form, not detailed but present, overlaps the silhouette of Havel's shoulder. Dalton writes, "It is breaking the boundary of the subject, crossing into their outline." This is something she had not considered possible up to this point. The figure had existed only as a distortion behind patients. Now its presence intrudes upon the subjects themselves. Her distress is evident in her writing. The pen strokes are harder, pressed deeper into the paper. Later in the afternoon, another patient, Andrea Hayes, returns for medication adjustment and is asked to sit for a follow-up photo. Hayes refuses at first. She keeps her back against the corridor wall, her eyes fixed not on Dalton, but on the narrow gap between the backdrop and the floor inside the room. She whispers, "I do not want it behind me." Dalton does not press her, but ultimately convinces her to at least step inside. The session lasts less than 2 minutes. Hayes holds perfectly still, staring somewhere just above the camera, lips trembling. The resulting images confirm Hayes's instinct. The figure is not only present, it is closer than ever. Dalton describes the new distortion as a double-formed, a shadow so dark it appears layered, like two silhouettes overlapping with slightly different poses. This duality is a new characteristic. It is also the clearest sign yet that the phenomenon is no longer stable, but shifting in how it manifests. And then comes the detail Dalton nearly misses. When she aligns the exposure sequence, left profile, right profile, forward portrait, she discovers that the backdrop in the second and third frames appears a few centimeters farther away, as though the room has subtly widened in the middle of the session. She checks her recordings, she checks her sketches, she checks the floor markings. Everything is unchanged, except the images. She writes, "The room is changing shape during the session. A small amount, but enough to register on film." This is the moment Dalton passes from investigator to something more vulnerable. Her writing shifts into shorter lines, more space between thoughts, as if she is grappling with the implications. She stays late into the night, long after the other staff have left. The hallway grows quiet. The building settles, and Dalton remains in the photography room staring at the right-hand corner. Her final entry that night is one of the clearest expressions of dread in her entire record. It is learning the shape of the room. Soon the room will not be able to contain it. She underlines only the last clause. At this point, Dalton has seen enough that any reasonable person would have requested reassignment, but she does not. Instead, she returns early the next morning, October 2nd, and conducts what can only be described as a deliberate provocation. She stands alone in the room, places the empty chair exactly where the distortion appears strongest, and waits with her camera ready. She takes a photograph of nothing, then another, and another. She develops them quickly, her notes growing more frantic. The first image is normal. The second shows a faint curvature in the backdrop. The third... She stops writing after this point. The line breaks off. She returns several minutes later, her handwriting shaky. There was something in the third image. I cannot describe it. Not a person, not a shadow. Something between. She ends her entry early with a line that bridges directly into the escalation that defines the rest of Part 2. It is beginning to appear, even when no one is standing there. This is the point at which the phenomenon is no longer tied solely to patience. It no longer requires human presence to shape itself. It is developing autonomy. And Dalton, alone in that dim room with her camera and her certainty, is beginning to realize she has been documenting the early stages of something that was not dormant, but waiting. Waiting to be seen, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to take form. By October 2nd, Dalton's testing has become increasingly deliberate, but also increasingly reckless. Where earlier she sought to understand the anomaly, she is now clearly trying to draw it out, to force it into visibility on her terms rather than its own. Her midday entry begins with a line that reveals more than she intended to confess. I need to see what it wants. She does not elaborate on what she believes it is, or how she came to that conclusion, but the rest of her behavior suggests she has formed an unspoken hypothesis, one she is afraid to write aloud. Her next recorded session is with a new patient, Faye Linden, a woman in her late 20s undergoing evaluation after a dissociative episode. Dalton notes that Linden appears calm, grounded, speaking politely to staff. But the moment she crosses the threshold into the photography room, she stops. Dalton writes, "She did not look frightened. She looked like she recognized something." Linden turns toward the right-hand corner, the corner that has anchored all the distortions, and narrows her eyes slightly as though trying to focus on something that remains out of sight. Dalton guides her gently toward the backdrop, trying not to draw attention to her own tension. The session begins normally, but during the right profile shot, Linden murmurs a question barely audible. Is he the one watching? Dalton does not respond. She is unsure if Linden is speaking to her or to something else. She completes the session mechanically and sends Linden back to the nurses. The development of these images marks a new shift in the phenomenon. In the first frame, left profile, the distortion is faint, no different from earlier ones. In the second frame, right profile, the figure appears with clearer structure, not crisp, not fully formed, but undeniably present. And in the forward portrait, Dalton sees something that freezes her mid-task. She stops writing, stops working, simply stares at the negative under the light. The figure leans forward, angled toward Linden's face, its posture bent as though trying to study her expression. Its blurred upper form now shows a slight dip near where a head might be, but not a shape Dalton can name. More like the suggestion of a tilt, her note is terse. It is interacting. Not merely observing, not merely appearing, interacting, responding, showing interest. Dalton spends the next hour trying to catalog the new characteristics, the angles, the positioning, the relative distance. Her analysis grows frantic, her handwriting more jagged. She tries to reproduce the effect with artificial light, but nothing matches. The distortion responds only to patience, and now perhaps to her. Because later that evening, after the building has quieted and she returns to the photography room for one last test, she feels something she cannot rationalize. She stands before the backdrop and switches off the overhead lamp, letting the room dim to a soft ambient glow from the hallway spill. She writes, "I stood where the patient stands. I waited." The next line is longer, slower, as if written while her hand trembled. Something stepped toward me. I did not hear it. I felt the air shift as it approached. She does not claim to have seen anything outright. Dalton is careful not to misreport her senses, but she insists that the displacement of air, the faint pressure she has noted for days, is now directional, approaching rather than drifting. She leaves the room quickly. She does not return that night. The following morning, October 3rd, brings the event that signals the full descent into the phenomenon. The backdrop is no longer flush against the wall. It hangs at a slight angle, the right edge pulled taut, and the left edge drooping almost imperceptibly. Dalton tries to adjust it back to its proper alignment. The fabric resists. She notes that this resistance is not physical. The rod and fastenings are loose enough that she should be able to correct the shift, yet the backdrop feels heavier, like someone is holding it in place from behind. She forces it into alignment anyway. It snaps back into misalignment within minutes. Her note is resigned. It does not want the backdrop straight. That afternoon, a patient named Rourke, not the psychiatrist, but the middle-aged man from earlier, reports to the nurses that he cannot sleep because the walls are breathing. The nurses record this as hallucination, no follow-up. But Dalton, after developing his new intake follow-up photographs, sees a related detail. The figure behind him is not only leaning forward, but its edges pulse slightly in the exposure, as if the image has captured motion that was not visible to her eye. She writes, "Shadows do not breathe. This one does." The next patient, Cordell, returns later that same day. The young woman appears exhausted, disoriented, but determined. She tells Dalton she has been hearing whispering in the corridor, voices that stop when she turns her head. Dalton asks whether she recognizes the voice. Cordell only shakes her head. During the forward portrait, Cordell's posture shifts subtly, as if bracing herself. Dalton tries to maintain composure, but she senses a heaviness in the air, a tension. When she develops the film, the figure behind Cordell has advanced so close that it is almost touching her shoulder. The boundary between subject and shadow becomes indistinct, a blending that defies the logic of lighting. Dalton's note is nearly illegible, the handwriting drawn tight. It is closing the distance. Meanwhile, the Ward E nursing logs escalate. 3 patients complain of a figure standing inside their rooms at night. 1 patient refuses to sleep with the lights off. Another claims someone whispered their name from behind the curtain. The staff continue to mark every report as hallucination. Dalton continues to document every pattern. By the evening of the 3rd, she is certain of something she never writes directly, but implies through repetition. The figure growing clearer in her images is not a reflection, not a byproduct, not a hallucination preserved on film. It is emerging, and the photography process, whatever its mechanism, is accelerating that emergence. The final line she records on October 3rd is the clearest statement she makes up to this point. The room is no longer waiting. It is participating. This marks the threshold between observation and intrusion, the moment when the phenomenon begins to manifest not only within the limits of Dalton's camera, but within the lived reality of Ward E. Part 2 will conclude with the next segment, where the boundary breaks in a way Dalton cannot ignore. By October 4th, Dalton arrives at the photography room before sunrise. Her notes indicate she does not sleep well the night before. She writes that she dreamed of standing in the room while something moved behind the backdrop. But she is careful to separate dream from record. Dalton does not attribute meaning to dreams. She focuses only on what she can verify. But when she opens the photography room that morning, she finds a detail that causes her to pause in the doorway. The backdrop is folded inward as though someone pressed against it from behind. The fold is slight, a gentle bow in the fabric, but the curvature is unmistakable. It is not sagging, it is not damage. It is pressure applied from the reverse side of a wall that has been sealed with welded metal plating since before Dalton was born. She steps closer, but not too close. She writes, "The fold is warm, only there. The rest of the fabric is cold." This warmth contradicts everything she knows about the sealed alcove behind the backdrop, an area cut off from the building's HVAC system decades earlier. She withdraws quickly. Later in the morning, she photographs Peter Sloan again for a follow-up evaluation. Sloan enters the room slowly, eyes darting from corner to corner. Dalton writes that he behaves like a man trying to avoid eye contact with someone he can see but cannot acknowledge. During the forward portrait, Sloan lifts his hand slightly, a reflexive gesture, as if brushing something away from his ear. Dalton hears nothing. She feels nothing. But Sloan whispers, "Do not touch me." Dalton stops the session. She escorts Sloan back to the hallway and asks if he is all right. He says nothing, only looks toward the photography room with a wary expression. When Dalton develops Sloan's images later, the figure behind him is clearer than ever. Too clear. The posture suggests height and a slight forward hunch. The upper portion, though still blurred, appears angled toward Sloan's head. Dalton writes, "It is leaning in, as if listening or smelling." This is the first time she attaches intention to the figure, not merely form, not merely movement. Intention. As she continues analyzing Sloan's images, a new anomaly emerges, one she had not seen in any earlier photographs. The distortion no longer affects only the shadow or backdrop. The light in the room itself appears to bend. In the second frame, the lamp's illumination pulls subtly toward the right-hand corner, as though trying to compensate for a presence absorbing or redirecting it. Photographs are not supposed to behave this way. Light does not bend without cause. Dalton tries repeatedly to dismiss this observation. She inspects the bulb, checks the lamp housing, tests every variable. But she cannot explain it. Her conclusion is short, heavy. It changes the light. That afternoon, Cordell returns for another photograph. Dalton does not request this. The ward staff bring her unannounced. Cordell looks exhausted, eyes sunken from lack of sleep. She stands in the doorway and refuses to enter at first. When Dalton asks her why, Cordell says, "It knows when I come in here." Dalton asks what she means. Cordell does not seem to hear her. Eventually, she steps inside. Dalton completes the left and right profiles without incident, but when she raises the camera for the forward portrait, Cordell's eyes fix abruptly on the right-hand corner, Dalton writes. She looked directly at something, not through it, at it. Cordell begins shaking, not from fear, but from certainty. The certainty of someone who recognizes a presence they cannot describe. She whispers, "He is closer today." Dalton lowers the camera. She considers stopping the session entirely, but Cordell steadies herself and says very quietly, "Take it. It wants you to see." Dalton takes the photograph. When she develops the final image that night, alone, the building quiet, the floor beneath her chair vibrating faintly with the hum of distant generators, she sees what Cordell sensed. The figure has stepped forward, no longer behind the patient, no longer confined to shadow. It stands between Cordell and the backdrop, its blurred upper form crossing the threshold of her silhouette. Not a full intersection, just the faintest intrusion, but enough to distort the alignment of Cordell's shoulder and the curve of her hair. Dalton writes. It is in front of her. She drops the pen. The ink trails across the page. She picks it up again after several moments and writes the next line with trembling restraint. This is no longer a shadow. This is a presence with mass. Her final entry for October 4th is the clearest expression of realization in her entire record. It is not appearing in the photographs. The photographs are revealing where it already stands. From this moment on, Dalton's notes lose the tone of inquiry and shift into something closer to resignation. She no longer questions whether the phenomenon is real. She no longer tests to confirm its behavior. She simply records its progression, a progression she understands she can no longer slow or control. And it is here, in the late hours of October 4th, in a quiet, emptied hospital wing where the lights flicker against walls no one has repaired in years, that Dalton writes the final line of Part 2. It is no longer waiting behind them, it is coming through. Everything beyond this belongs to Part 3, the point at which Ward E's hidden occupant stops shaping shadows and begins shaping outcomes. By the time October 5th arrives, the anomalies in Ward E have moved beyond the reach of denial. They have also moved beyond the boundaries of the photography room. The first entry in Dalton's final notebook is short, written as though with a shaking hand. Something is wrong in the hallways. She does not elaborate immediately. Instead, she begins the day by describing the room as she finds it. The backdrop pulled farther inward than before, the fold sharper, the corner darker at its base, despite the overhead lamp's direct illumination. She writes that the plastic sheeting seems to cling to the metal wall behind it, as if drawn inward by a vacuum no air system could produce. She stands in the doorway for several minutes before entering. Her note: the space feels occupied even from here. Her morning intake is with Faye Linden, the patient whose previous image showed the clearest leaning of the figure. Linden enters the room with visible discomfort, one hand pressed lightly against her throat, as though steadying her pulse. Dalton remarks that Linden asks if the session can be brief, but what matters is not Linden's fear, it is her certainty. Dalton writes, she avoided the right-hand corner. She walked around it as if stepping around a person. Dalton positions her quickly and completes the first two exposures with minimal delay. But during the forward portrait, something happens that Dalton struggles to describe. Linden's hair lifts slightly, not dramatically, not like a gust, but just enough that a few strands rise, as though touched by a static charge, or by something unseen moving close to her face. Dalton lowers the camera immediately. Lyndon whispers almost inaudibly, "He stood too near." Dalton ends the session. When she develops the film later, she sees what Lyndon sensed: the figure is no longer merely overlapping the patient. The blurred upper form, previously diffuse and abstract, is now angled unmistakably toward Lyndon's face, its posture low, as though bending close to her ear. Dalton writes, "It is communicating." She stops for nearly 20 minutes before continuing. At this point, the record begins to widen. We no longer have only Dalton's observations. Staff testimonies and environmental reports begin to show parallel cracks. A nurse on duty that morning records that multiple patients refused to enter the hallway outside the photography room. One claimed he saw someone standing by the door. Another insisted that when the hallway lights flickered, he saw a long shadow at the corner of the ceiling. Maintenance logs show a brief report of fluctuating voltage in E-Wing. The reading spikes for less than a second, then normalizes. The event is marked as inconclusive. But Dalton's next entry confirms the true escalation. She writes, "I saw something in the reflection." She is referring to the small viewing window in the darkroom's steel door, a rectangle of safety glass that had fogged around the edges over the years. Dalton writes that while preparing chemical trays, she glanced toward the window and saw, not behind her but in the reflection, a shape leaning at an angle impossible for any human figure, a long, forward-tilted outline, a slight curve at the top, a posture she recognized immediately. She turned. No one was behind her. The room was still, but she writes, "The reflection remained a few seconds after I turned." She does not pursue this event further in her notes. She moves past it quickly, almost clinically, as though by refusing to describe it fully, she might prevent it from becoming real. Later that afternoon, Dalton photographs Andrea Hayes again. Hayes looks worse than the previous day, pale, unfocused, her movements slow. Dalton notes that the nurses reported that Hayes barely slept. She kept waking to the sound of breathing, though no one else in the ward heard anything. During the intake session, Hayes refuses to stand in the marked position. She clings to the side wall instead, trembling. Dalton convinces her to take a single forward portrait. Hayes stares straight into the camera, eyes wide, fixed. Dalton writes, "She looked like someone who expected pain." When she develops the film, Dalton finds the most significant escalation in the entire record up to this point. The figure is no longer behind Hayes, no longer leaning, no longer shadow. It is beside her, standing adjacent to her right arm, occupying the same plane of the image, still blurred, still undefined, but positioned in a way that no shadow or light artifact could create. Dalton's note is uncharacteristically emotional. This is the first time it has stood on the same side of the subject as the lamp, meaning it is no longer tied to darkness or to background. It is occupying light, and therefore occupying the same physical space as the subject. She writes, I believe it can step out of the corner now." Her next lines grow even more hesitant. It is not confined to the frame. The camera only reveals its movement. This realization changes her tone permanently. The remainder of her entries no longer ask what the phenomenon is. They only ask what it will do next. In the evening of October 5th, as she leaves the photography room and walks down the hall, Dalton hears a voice, not behind her, not beside her, ahead. A male voice, soft, murmuring something she cannot decipher. She approaches cautiously, but the sound recedes, as though moving ahead of her, always staying just around the corner. She turns the corner. The hallway is empty. She returns to the photography room and listens at the door. Inside, nothing. Silence. Except the faintest creak of the backdrop rod settling against the metal wall. Her entry ends with a sentence that signals the full descent. The collapse of the barrier between presence and influence. It is no longer in the photographs only. It is in the wing. This marks the beginning of the next phase, the point where Ward E itself becomes the medium. Everything beyond this belongs to the deeper portion of Part 3, where the phenomenon's nature transitions from concealed to unmistakable. By the morning of October 6th, Dalton's notes no longer treat the phenomenon as confined to the photography room. Everything she records now points towards something expanding outward, not aggressively, not chaotically, but like a slow, deliberate tide. Her voice changes here. The careful distance of a technician begins to slip, replaced by a clarity that borders on dread. The day begins with a simple observation. The wing feels changed. She describes walking down the east corridor toward the photography room and noticing that the fluorescent lights, always unreliable, flicker with a rhythm she has not seen before. Not random. Not electrical failure, more like a pulse. She listens carefully. There is no audible hum, yet the flicker feels timed, as though responding to her footsteps. She stops. The flicker continues for a moment, then stops too. She writes, "The hallway matched my pauses." The observation is understated, almost gentle, but the meaning is unmistakable. Something in the environment responds to her presence with unnerving precision. When Dalton opens the photography room that morning, she does not immediately enter. She stands in the doorway, sensing something beyond her ability to articulate. The air feels stale again, thick with stillness. But more than that, she writes that the volume of the room feels wrong, too big, too empty, like the dimensions have shifted by inches, enough to be felt but not seen. She takes one step inside. The sound of her own footfall seems muffled, as though cushioned by something that should not be there. Her next entry. The silence is heavier today. She inspects the backdrop again. The bow in the fabric is more pronounced. The right-hand edge curves toward the sealed wall, as though drawn inward by force. She touches the fabric gently. It feels warm, warmer than the air around it. She pulls her hand away instantly. The first patient of the day is Julian, the quiet young man photographed during her earlier experiments. Dalton notes that he seems disoriented as he approaches the room, staring at the floor rather than at the walls. When she asks if he's all right, he says something she writes down carefully. They keep walking around in here. Dalton asks who he means. Julian shakes his head. I do not know, but I hear them. He steps into the room reluctantly, eyes fixed on the corner. His breathing quickens. Dalton positions him and begins the session quickly to reduce his distress. When she develops his images, she discovers a new characteristic. The figure does not appear behind him. Not this time. It appears to his left, near the edge of the frame, partially obscured but undeniably present, as though it has changed its position to avoid being centered, like an animal shifting around a beam of light. Dalton notes. It moved to avoid the camera. This is new. The phenomenon is no longer simply approaching subjects. It is reacting to Dalton's actions, avoiding, adjusting, shifting position within the environment. But the escalation does not stop there. Dalton describes something she experiences while reviewing Julian's prints, something that marks, in her own quiet way, the beginning of terror. She writes, Someone whispered behind me. She freezes. She listens. Nothing. She turns. The dark room is empty. She convinces herself it was the ventilation system, even though the system has been non-functional since July. She writes this rationalization down as though trying to anchor herself. Then she adds, It said my name. This line is smaller than the others, as though she wrote it reluctantly, almost against her own impulse. She does not strike it out. She leaves it. Later that afternoon, Dalton photographs Andrea Hayes yet again. At this point, Hayes has become almost a barometer for the phenomenon's visibility. Whenever it intensifies, Hayes senses it first. Hayes enters the room trembling. She clutches the doorway with one hand, resisting the pull of whoever is escorting her. She does not speak, but her breathing is shallow and panicked. Dalton tries to reassure her. Hayes does not respond. Her eyes stay fixed on the same right-hand corner. Dalton takes a single forward portrait, intending to end the session quickly. When she develops the negative, still damp, still tacky in the tray, she recoils. For the first time, the figure is fully upright, no longer hunched, no longer leaning. The blurred upper form rises nearly to the top of the frame, towering over the space where the backdrop curves inward. Dalton writes, It is standing at its full height, and then a few lines later, it is no longer a shadow, it is mass without form. She studies the negative under different lamps, looking for flaws, but the result is always the same. The figure occupies space, it blocks light. It casts blurry intersections across Hayes's hair and shoulder. She writes, It is real enough to interrupt exposure. The nursing logs from that same afternoon contain their own escalation. 3 separate patients refuse to walk past the photography room door. One claims he saw a man bending the wall. Another reports hearing footsteps following her down the corridor. A third refuses medication until the overhead lights are turned fully on. These reports are logged with the usual dismissive shorthand: delusion, anxiety episode, lack of sleep. but the frequency and consistency mark a shift that no one else noticed at the time, except Dalton, who was facing the phenomenon's most direct manifestation. Yet, her last entry for the 6th is among the most chilling in the entire record, written in cramped lines at the bottom of the page. I left the room for 10 minutes. When I returned, the backdrop was flat again, completely flat, like the fold had never been there. Dalton tests it, touches the fabric, and finds it cold for the first time in days. Her final line: "It is hiding now." That is where segment 2 ends, with Dalton realizing that the phenomenon is no longer revealing itself inadvertently. It is learning. It is choosing when to be seen. And by the following morning, it will no longer need the camera at all. By October 7th, Dalton is no longer documenting a phenomenon. She is documenting an emergence. Her first entry that morning reads like an apology to herself. I should not go back in, but I will. She does not explain why, but her notes make it clear that she feels responsible now, not for the anomaly itself, but for understanding it before it crosses whatever threshold it seems intent on reaching. The hallway outside the photography room is unusually quiet that morning, quieter than the rest of the wing. The fluorescent lights flicker with that same slow rhythm she noted earlier. Not frantic, but steady, almost hypnotic. She writes that the air feels stale and warm, like a room filled with too many sleepers. When she reaches the door, she pauses, not to listen, to steady herself. She unlocks it. The photography room is not empty. At least it does not feel empty. Dalton writes that the moment she steps inside, she senses something near the backdrop. Not visual, not auditory, but spatial. A wrongness in the shape of the room, as though the corner that had bowed inward has now expanded outward in a way she cannot see directly. The air smells different too, metallic, faintly like overheated circuitry. She approaches the backdrop carefully. It is perfectly flat again, completely still, cold to the touch. And this, she writes, frightens her far more than the earlier distortions. It is preparing something, a pause before movement. Her first intake that morning is Havel, the thin, soft-spoken man who has appeared multiple times in her records. Dalton notes that Havel seems calmer than usual, almost sedate, as though exhausted beyond fear. When he enters the photography room, however, his demeanor changes instantly. Dalton writes that Havel stiffens, head snapping toward the same right-hand corner with sudden clarity, like a man startled awake. He shakes his head repeatedly, whispering, "No, no, no." Dalton tries to calm him, but Havel refuses to step any farther inside. He grips the door frame with both hands. She asks if he wants to reschedule. Havel says, "He knows you're here." Dalton freezes. She has never heard a patient say anything like that. She tries to ask what he means, but Havel refuses to enter and is escorted back down the hall. Dalton does not photograph him, but she notes the tension he sensed, the awareness, and writes, "It reacts to me now." Her next intake is Julian, the young man who hears the walking. Julian is jittery, pacing in short, repetitive steps as the nurse leads him toward the photography room. He keeps rubbing his palms on his hospital clothing as if trying to dry sweat that will not go away. He hesitates at the threshold and mutters, "It waits for us. It waits right there." Dalton positions him as quickly as possible to minimize distress. As she raises the camera, Julian flinches before she reaches the shutter. She asks what's wrong. Julian says, almost conversationally, "He moved closer. I can feel him." Dalton takes the forward portrait, hands shaking, desperate to complete the session. She sends Julian back to the ward and heads directly to the dark room to develop the film. This photograph becomes one of the most defining images in the entire record. For the first time, the figure is not blurred beyond comprehension. It has density. Dalton does not describe a face. There is no face, but the head shape, previously amorphous, now bears a contour, a dip at the top, a slight ridge along one angle, still inhuman, still obscure, but undeniably closer to form. She writes, "It is resolving, as if the camera gives it definition." She compares Julian's portrait to his previous ones. The progression is unmistakable. The figure is maturing in clarity, like a photograph developing in stages across multiple days. Her next line, "It is becoming aware of the camera." This is the first time Dalton suggests that the entity understands the process, that it might be cooperating with the exposure, or using it. Around midday, Dalton ventures into the corridor for a brief break. She writes that the hallway feels colder than before. Not everywhere, just in a line stretching from the photography room door to the double doors near the medication station. A cold path. She follows it cautiously. At the midpoint of the corridor, she hears a soft drag, like fabric brushing across tile. She turns quickly. No one is there. Her note. "The sound came from behind me." She is finding it harder to ignore, harder to explain away. And then she notes something important, something subtle but chilling. "The light behind me dimmed for a moment as I walked, as if something passed between me and the fixture." She turns again. Nothing, but the flicker lingers in her mind. Later that afternoon, Andrea Hayes is brought in. Again. Hayes is terrified. She refuses to enter the room until Dalton reassures her gently, though both women know that reassurance means nothing. Hayes steps inside, trembling, her eyes fixed downward, unwilling to look anywhere near the corner. Dalton takes only 2 exposures, trying to minimize the time Hayes must stand there. During the second shot, Hayes gasps, a short, sharp intake, and whips her head to the right. Dalton snaps the shutter at that exact moment. She does not ask what Hayes saw. She does not want to. When the negatives develop, the second photograph contains an escalation that Dalton cannot rationalize. The figure is not behind Hayes, not beside her, not leaning in. It is between her and the backdrop, occupying the literal space where Hayes is physically standing. The silhouette splits her outline, not violently but impossibly, bending the contour of her shoulders as though the figure's presence partially displaces her shape. Dalton drops the negative onto the table. Her hands shake. She writes, "It is crossing into the subject. It bends their outline. It changes how they appear before the exposure finishes." She circles this line twice. Then beneath it a final thought, one she writes with absolute clarity. It does not need the corner anymore. The phenomena that once clung to a single fixed point in the room has begun to detach, to move, to choose where to stand, to choose who to stand near. Ward E is no longer a place where it hides. It is a place where it lives. And by Dalton's next entry, the consequences of that shift will become unmistakable. By October 8th, Dalton's notes reflect a profound change in her understanding of the situation. She no longer describes the phenomenon as emerging. She describes it as present. Her first entry that morning contains a line that sets the tone for everything that follows. It is not growing stronger. It is becoming revealed. She does not repeat this phrasing again, but the idea anchors every observation that day. The figure was always there. The room and the patients were merely the means by which it disclosed itself. When Dalton enters the photography room that morning, she immediately senses the air has changed again. Not stale this time, but charged, like the electrical tension before a thunderstorm. The backdrop is flat. The lamp burns steadily, but the right-hand corner feels empty in the wrong way, a void rather than a space. Dalton stands still, listening. Then she does something she has never done before. She speaks into the room. "Are you here?" she writes afterward. "I felt pressure in the air, not a response, a recognition." She does not repeat the attempt. The first patient of the day is Rourke, the middle-aged man who earlier insisted that someone was bending the wall. He enters the hall slowly, pausing several times on the way to the room. Dalton notes that he seems disoriented, not from medication but from a kind of spatial confusion. When he reaches the doorway, he hesitates. Dalton instructs him calmly, but Rourke's attention is fixed on the floor near the backdrop. He asks, "Is someone standing there?" Dalton tells him no. Rourke shakes his head. Someone is standing there. He steps inside anyway, almost unconsciously, his eyes trailing slowly upward as though watching something rise from the floor. Dalton takes only one photograph. Rourke leaves quickly after, refusing to speak. When Dalton develops the image, she discovers something she has not seen before. The floor shadows themselves have changed shape. The elongated silhouette behind Rourke no longer adheres to human proportions. It fans outward at the bottom, widening, as though the figure's lower portion spreads across the tile like liquid darkness. The distortion climbs higher on the backdrop as well, forming an apex at nearly the same height as the overhead lamp. Dalton writes, "It is not standing on the floor, it is anchored deeper." She sits for several minutes before adding, "It is not using our shadow to appear. It is using our light to shape itself." This marks the first time she recognizes that the figure interacts with illumination itself, not simply by blocking it, but by influencing how it behaves. The second patient, Julian, arrives shortly after. Dalton notes that he looks worse. pale, unsteady, unable to focus. He whispers that he hasn't slept. They move around inside the walls, he says. Dalton asks who. Julian whispers, he does, just him. He steps into the photography room, but not willingly. His hands grip the door frame as if resisting an invisible pull. Then Julian stops mid-stride. His eyes lock on a point directly beside Dalton. Not behind her, not at the corner, but next to her, as though something stands inches from her shoulder. Dalton writes. His gaze tracked something I could not see. I felt warmth on my left side, like a person exhaled there. She steps back instinctively. Julian's eyes follow. Dalton raises the camera only once. The shutter clicks. Julian flinches violently, then pushes past her and flees the room without waiting for release. When Dalton develops that image, she finds what she expected and what she feared. The figure is beside her, not the patient. For the first time, the phenomenon appears tangled with Dalton's own position in the room. Its blurred upper form leans in her direction, overlapping the space where her arm had been during exposure. The distortion bends the silhouette of the chair behind her, Dalton writes. It is moving independently of the subject. It chose to stand beside me. Then, after several blank lines, it is aware of me. The shift becomes unmistakable. Later that afternoon, Dalton leaves the photography room briefly to retrieve more film. She walks down the hall, turns into the supply closet, and begins gathering materials. The closet is narrow, barely large enough for one person. As she stands with her back to the door, she hears a sound behind her. A soft inhale, then a long, slow exhale. Not breath, but the impression of breath. A shift of air against her neck. She turns. No one is there. The doorway is empty. The hall is empty. Dalton drops a roll of film, her fingers trembling too hard to retrieve it. She closes the closet door and writes the following, only after she returns to the dark room. It followed me outside the photography room. This is the moment the phenomenon ceases to be location-bound. It has extended beyond its original point, no longer anchored to the other side of the backdrop. It moves. By evening, the entire wing begins to show signs of the presence. Patients refuse to walk near the far wall. A nurse reports feeling someone brush past her, though no one was nearby. Another staff member hears pacing footsteps at the end of the hall. None of these incidents are logged officially, but Dalton records echoes of them. Rourke would not sleep unless the lights were on. Hayes cried when I walked her past the photography room. Julian stared at the ceiling, following something I could not see. And then, the most chilling entry of the day. I saw a shadow where no one stood. She describes walking down the hall, glancing toward the double doors, and seeing a long, narrow outline stretch across the tile, an outline cast by nothing, no staff, no patient, just a tall, motionless shape. She approaches cautiously. The shadow pulls back into the corner, not disappears. Pulls back, she writes, it steps away when confronted. This shows understanding, not instinct, understanding. Dalton ends her entry for October 8th with a sentence that marks the formal threshold between revelation and consequence. It is learning to move where we look. By the following morning, it will no longer need to hide at all. October 9th is the last day for which we have any coherent record of Mira Dalton's experience. Not because the notes cease abruptly, they do, but because the events of that day make further documentation impossible. Her first entry that morning is longer than usual and unusually confessional. I do not know what will happen today, but I know it has begun moving freely in this wing. She describes waking before her alarm, feeling watched even in her dormitory room in the staff building. She writes that she slept with the light on, something she had not done since childhood, and that the air near her door felt colder than the rest of the room, but she still returns to Ward E. When she reaches the corridor outside the photography room, she freezes. The hallway is silent but not empty. Dalton writes that the air feels full, as though the space is occupied by more than its walls can contain. The fluorescent lights no longer flicker. They remain perfectly still, undisturbed, as if holding their breath. She approaches the door slowly. The doorknob is warm, not warm as though from a heater, warm the way a doorknob feels after someone has held it. For a long time, Dalton unlocks it and immediately steps back. The photography room is not dark. It is bright, too bright. The overhead lamp is at maximum output, flooding the room with a sterile intensity it has never produced in the weeks she's worked there. The backdrop hangs perfectly flat. The plastic sheeting does not move, does not bow, does not ripple. The room looks cleaner than she left it, as though scrubbed, but Dalton knows instantly that the brightness is not natural. It is compensatory. The light is a defense. She stands in the doorway, trembling, and writes, "Whatever is here is strong enough that the light tries to erase it." She steps inside. Her first patient is Andrea Hayes. Dalton does not request her. The nurse escorts her without explanation. Hayes looks exhausted, her eyes swollen from lack of sleep. She keeps her left hand pressed to the side of her face. When she enters the photography room, she begins crying immediately, not loudly but quietly, hopelessly. She stares at the backdrop. Dalton asks if she can hold still. Hayes whispers, "He is here." Dalton asks where. Hayes slowly lifts her hand and points directly to the space beside Dalton's right shoulder. Dalton writes, "I do not turn to look." She takes one photograph, then she ends the session. When Hayes leaves, Dalton does not process the film immediately. She cannot bring herself to stay in the room alone. Instead, she walks to the break area and sits with her notebook on her lap, staring at the blank page for several minutes before writing, "I am not afraid to develop the image. I am afraid to see what is already in the room." After nearly an hour, she returns to the dark room. She develops Hayes's portrait, and there, in the first frame, she sees a moment that does not resemble any earlier distortion. No elongated shadow, no bending light, no blurred silhouette. The figure is upright, standing at full height, only inches behind Hayes, its form clearer than ever before. Though its features remain blurred, the upper portion shows curvature, not entry 2, not light, not shadow. The space changed shape when it moved. Entry 3, it knows I have been documenting it. There are no more patient photographs, no more temperature notes, no more sketches. Only one final line written at the bottom of the page, separated from the others by nearly an inch of blank paper. It stood in front of me. The pen stroke falters at the end of the sentence. There is no Part 3 entry after this. No October 10th. No final attempts at understanding. No closing thoughts. Dalton's notebook ends there. The final pages are blank. The materials from Harrowick State Hospital end abruptly after Dalton's final written line. There is no formal report of her disappearance. No entry in the state staffing logs. No indication that she transferred or resigned in the months following October of 1986. Ward E itself was shuttered, allegedly for structural concerns. But the renovation that followed removed far more than cracked flooring or faulty wiring. The entire East photography suite was stripped to bare concrete, its walls reinforced and sealed. No one involved in the renovation signed their names to the work orders, and the surviving documents show only initials, as though the individuals responsible did not want their identities recorded. Dalton's notebooks, the damaged negatives, and the handful of statements from staff all indicate a common truth. Something within that wing revealed itself only when photographed. Something tied not to the camera, but to the act of being observed. Her notes form an arc of understanding. A young technician slowly realizing she was not documenting anomalies, but triggering a form of emergence. I have reviewed her negatives. The distortions in them remain unstable even now, decades later. When viewed under bright light, the blurred silhouette seems to shift in ways that do not fully align with the surrounding shadows. The darker exposures, especially the final portraits of Hayes and Julian, still carry a residual haze that chemical cleaning cannot remove. They feel weighty, as though the image itself holds depth beyond the two-dimensional surface. One negative, the final portrait of Andrea Hayes, was damaged beyond recovery. The emulsion buckled inward, warping the frame in a tight curve. The distortion resembles a pressure mark, as though the material had been held between two unseen surfaces. This negative was found separate from the others, sealed inside an evidence envelope, with no accompanying explanation. The hospital's internal memos from that period do not mention Dalton directly, but there is a brief reference to technician absence near the end of October, followed by scheduling requests to outsource photographic work. The request was denied. Several weeks later, Ward E was officially closed. I was able to trace only one staff member who remained at Harrowick during the transition. In an unsigned, undated note found tucked inside an unrelated personnel file, the writer describes the final days of the wing. The phrasing is imprecise, likely out of fear or caution, but they mention that certain patients refused to enter the corridor leading to the photography room. They reported hearing breathing behind the walls, footsteps during rounds, and a sense that the building was bending in ways they could not articulate. The note ends with a single sentence. It started with the pictures. That at least aligns with Dalton's record. The broader question, what Dalton encountered, remains unanswered. The figure in her photographs never fully resolves. Even in its clearest state, it lacks detail. No features, no limbs, no face. Only a shape that suggests hunger for definition. A form dependent on proximity to those who inhabit the space. Something that waits for eyes, for lenses, for attention, and then uses that attention to become more. Vault 13 holds several artifacts that share this quality. Entities or phenomena that reveal themselves through interaction rather than observation alone. A pattern of reciprocation. Dalton's case is one of the earliest and most complete examples of that mechanism, though even here the data is incomplete. Her final entry, "It stood in front of me," offers no description of what she saw in that moment, only that she recognized it as the same presence forming in her prints. The absence of any subsequent record suggests that whatever confronted her did not require further exposure. Whether it moved beyond Ward E or whether the room itself served as a boundary is unclear. The hospital closed the wing quickly, then abandoned the building itself only a few years later. Renovation workers reported strange acoustics in the East Corridor, but nothing documented, nothing substantial. By then, the entity, if it continued to manifest, left no physical traces that survived state review. If not for the anonymous box delivered here decades later, the events of Ward E would have remained unrecorded. Even now, the origin of that delivery is unknown. The address label has faded. The courier log shows no signature. I have returned Dalton's notebooks to their containment chamber. The pages remain stable under controlled light. The negatives, however, must be stored under reduced illumination. Prolonged exposure to brightness has caused minor fluctuations in their emulsion, small shifts in the silhouette that repeat even when the images are kept still. The shifts are subtle, barely perceptible, but consistent, as though the figure inside them is still aligning itself, still adjusting its posture. If anyone should view these materials in the future, caution is advised. Do not examine the negatives for long durations without supervision. Do not stand directly before the sealed chamber with the lights off. And above all, do not attempt to reproduce Dalton's process. Her photographs revealed something that lived in the dark. Her lens gave it shape. Her persistence gave it form. We do not know what would happen if that process were repeated. For now, this file is marked with restricted classification and locked within the deep archive. This concludes the recovered record known as The Portraits of Ward E, the Archivist, Vault 13.